lecture is about the rise of nuclear power and the creation of the civil nuclear industry right the way through from the late 1950s with the birth of the first ever commercial power plants through to the late 1970s, where we see the peak in terms of Western Europe and the US of the number of power plants being built and operated. If we come back to our original 5 questions we were asking ourselves at the beginning of this lecture in terms of what are the driving forces for the development of nuclear power in the world today and how those changed in the past and led to where we are, we saw in the first part of the lecture the dominant force, driving force for developing nuclear energy was for military purposes. It was for production of plutonium primarily, and that dominated certainly in the 1940s and early 50s in all of the countries that have weapons nowadays. What we will see in this particular lecture is that changes, and there's a shift between military and civilian, with the majority of the development work being geared towards civilian power plants. And so we see a different emphasis and a different change, and governments are thinking of nuclear power not primarily as something that's a military technology, but something that's very much in a civilian sphere. Let's travel back to the 1950s and 1960s, about 60, 70 years ago. Let's think about what we would do if we wanted to generate electricity. What type of technology are we likely to use and what's available to us? Well, if you have a large supply of coal, and the UK certainly did, and the US did, and places like Germany did, and lots of European nations did, then that is your technology of choice. You will build a large coal-fired power station, and that's exactly what happened in the UK. If you don't have coal, you maybe have access to hydro. Maybe you've got lots of mountains, lots of rivers and things like that, in which case you can build lots of power stations. Some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, have very big hydroelectric power programs and have generated a lot of electricity for a long time like that. If you have neither of those, perhaps you can have oil and gas. Although oil and gas in the 1950s was really primarily used for transport, it wasn't really being used mostly a lot for electricity production, certainly not gas anyway. Solar and wind certainly out the window. They've not really been developed at all. Very few people, if any, will be using those to generate electricity. If you have neither coal, nor hydro, nor gas, then you probably want to look at a new technology called atomic power. There are technologies that have now been developed and available through the US and the UK. There's creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program that translates the military technology into the commercial sphere, and perhaps you can create your own nuclear power program. And in fact, one country did do that. That's France. Didn't really have a lot of coal, had some hydro, and had to think about a growing and developing economy in the 1950s, how it would get access to power. Now, the driver for the UK was we did have lots of coal, but we had an expanding economy and we couldn't build coal-fired power stations quick enough, essentially. So the UK decided also to move into nuclear as well, as a strategic balancing between different types of energy generation. It's the 1950s and we have the birth of the civil nuclear industry, with our first generation of reactors being built and brought on stream through various means, like the Magnox reactor in the UK and the water reactors in the US. And we have this man, Lewis Strauss, who's the chair of the new US Atomic Energy Commission, who makes this famous quote that our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. Unfortunately, that's a phrase that has come back to haunt the nuclear industry many times, I must admit. But it was a huge optimistic age, and nuclear power was seen as being a panacea for all sorts of things. Clean energy, cheap energy, much better than coal, and therefore lots and lots of different countries around the world were looking at it as a way of generating their electricity. Dr. Jar has taken you through the different types of reactor technologies, so you'll be familiar with the Magnox reactor, which was the first generation of reactors that were built in the UK. It stood for magnesium non-oxidizing, and it referred to the actual fuel cladding there. So there's a picture of a fuel rod that goes into a Magnox reactor. You can see you've got large fins for cooling, and it was made out of a magnesium alloy. And it picked up on some of the features that were built into Windscale Power 1 and 2, and the fact that it was graphite core, with, instead of air, carbon dioxide gas was used as the coolant. Obvious safety features there is that you don't have the potential risk of a fire with CO2 compared to something like air being blown through potentially hot graphite. The moderator is the graphite, and the fuel elements were loaded in vertically into the graphite blocks that were there. It wasn't pressurized, so it had a concrete biological shield, and the hot CO2 gas would recirculate through a steam generator vessel like that. And that's our primary difference between anything that's military compared to civilian, and the fact that we're trying to maximize the amount of energy that goes through here in order to maximize the amount of steam that can be used to generate electricity. And that's what a Magnox reactor looks like, or in fact that's what the first ever Magnox reactor looks like. And the 27th of August 1956 is a date to go down in civil nuclear power history as the date that the first ever civilian nuclear power station came on stream and generated power that then went into the grid. And the Calder Hall reactors at the Windscale site, very near to where the Windscale piles were, which is now the Sellafield site, were built, and there was a series of 4 reactors that were built, two buildings. You can just, off to the side here is the other building, and each one of those contained 2 reactors, so there were 4 Magnox units in total. And you can see here these are the actual steam generators that go with the reactors, and there's the building, so the reactor would be inside here, and these are the fuel marshalling ponds and the various areas that allow you to fuel and defuel. And all of the fuel was dealt with on the Sellafield site. There was a reprocessing facility that went with it as well, so the spent fuel was dealt with directly on the Sellafield site. So the whole of the fuel cycle was covered in one area. In the US, we see the first commercially funded power stations come on stream with the Dresden and Shippingport pressurized water reactors that are built, and the Americans go for development of the pressurized water reactor and the boiling water reactor, which is an offshoot really of their military program, because they were developing PWRs for use in military situations like submarines and also ships that came later on. And in the 1960s, we see the Generation 1 reactor fleet being developed and built in the UK. So the Magnox reactors were built through the 1960s. And in the 1960s, we see the first fleet of PWRs being built, and early reactors in France and other places like Japan. But it's the 1970s really when it becomes mainstream. We're into our second generation of nuclear power stations that have been developed with experience of operating and running the early ones like the Magnox reactor. So the technology is starting to become mature. However, things are starting to change. The political landscape within the UK has changed. The Magnox fleet were designed and built through government money. The advanced gas reactor fleet was to a certain extent designed and built through government money, because we had a central electricity generating board, a state-run electricity organisation. But things are changing politically in the UK, and things like privatisation and creeping in. There's still an issue with proliferation. We see the Cold War coming to its height in the 1960s and 70s, which has an impact on the development and spread of civil nuclear power, both in Western Europe and in the USA as well. The 1960s and 1970s are important politically for nuclear power, especially civilian nuclear power, because we see some important international treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty that are created, and countries sign up to them around the world, and that creates a clear divide between military and civilian nuclear power. And it means that we create this system of what's called safeguards, which are a regulatory framework run by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that means that in order to run a civilian nuclear power program, you have to regulate that correctly, and you also have to control the movement of fissile material in order to prove that you're not directing that into an illicit weapons program. And that allows nuclear power to say, from a civilian perspective, it's not to do with weapons. So politically, there's a clear distinction between the two of them. In the US, though, there is this serious and very, very important decision by President Carter, which was the president between 1976 and 1980 in the US. And President Carter, once signing of the Proliferation Treaty was complete, decided that the US would not be an agent for proliferation and banned reprocessing of fuel. In other words, the closed fuel cycle in the US was politically closed off, and only open fuel cycles were allowed after that. So reprocessing that creates or potentially can create plutonium for use in weapons program, essentially what had been happening at Hanford for many decades, was closed off politically in the US. And that, to a certain extent, sent a negative message throughout the world in terms of nuclear power, and the fact that things like recycling of fuel, closing the fuel cycle, development of new reactors is not something that the US was politically interested in anymore. Let's look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty, probably the most important piece of legislation that affects the way in which we operate our civilian nuclear power programs around the world. Currently, there's 188 countries around the world have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think out of about 195 or so that are registered in the UN. There's one country that actually signed it and withdrew, that's North Korea. And I'm sure anybody who's seen anything in the news can understand probably why they've done that. There were some very high-profile cases of countries that have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, South Africa, Libya and Syria, although some of them have actually now signed it and have been brought into the fold, so to speak. The implications of that was that if you didn't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries that had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty would not cooperate with you. So for many, many years, for example, the Indians have had to create their own independent nuclear fuel development program, a nuclear reactor development program, because the international community, the US, the UK, the French, would not deal with them because that was breaking the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are actual signed versions of the treaty, referred to as depository governments. So the UK and the Russian Federation and the US hold the actual physical treaty that's been signed, and once it came into force in the 1970s, 5th of March 1970, that led to a series of subsequent legislations and led to this comprehensive test ban treaty. And I suppose that halted in terms of any form of weapons testing at all, because that would break in some of the articles of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another important development we see in the 1960s and 70s, whilst the number of reactors are being built and there's an increase in reactor fleet size throughout the world, like France and America especially, is we see the rise of commercialism, and large corporations are built on the basis of being able to supply reactors around the world. And we see some of the names that still exist today and really the titans of the nuclear industry around the world internationally. So we see the creation of the Westinghouse Corporation, and they lead on the development of pressurized water reactors. And we still see that today in terms of the types of pressurized water reactors that are being built now in the Far East, for example, are based on Westinghouse designs. The AP1000, the AP1400 that's being built in Korea. We see the BWR technology led and developed by a corporation called General Electric, and that still exists today as part of a conglomerate with Hitachi, GE Hitachi, and they lead on building and developing an advanced boiling water reactor version of that. That was going to be one of the candidates in the UK, for example. And in France, we see organisations being created that partly state-owned but run as autonomous organisations. We see Kojima, and Kojima is the organisation involved in fuel cycles, so things like making fuel and especially reprocessing fuel and dealing with spent fuel from the French fleet is done through Kojima. That's gone through a number of name changes and is now currently called Orano. It used to be called Areva a few years ago. And the design of reactors that was originally came from early designs of Westinghouse PWRs, but is now very much a French design of reactor, was created through this organisation called Framatome. they exist again now as well. They've come back, and those are the, for example, those are the organisations that are designed and own the rights and the IP associated with the reactor that's being built at Hinkley Point C. So that's a French PWR that's been designed and built and developed through the French system. So these are very big organisations that still exist in some form or other today, and if you look at most of the reactors around the world, they have some links back to the 1970s when these organisations were created. We can look to the type of reactor designs and technology that was implemented in the UK and around the world, and we can see perhaps how the rise of nuclear power is probably linked to those large commercial organisations. In the UK, we decided, and I say we, the UK government through the Central Electricity Generating Board, we decided to develop our gas-cooled nuclear technologies further. So the Magnox reactor was evolved into the advanced gas reactor, and we have 14 reactors of those that were built, and they're all operated at the moment in the UK. All the Magnox reactors are now shut down, and these were developed in the 1960s and built in the 1970s, and we expect them probably to operate for another 5 or 6 years. Now, in terms of other countries taking up gas-cooled reactor systems, there's very few. There's probably only about 1 or 2 of the actual reactors themselves were ever built. There was a couple of Magnox reactors, one in Italy and one in Japan, but there's no AGRs ever built overseas. So they're purely UK reactor technology that was the bedrock of our nuclear technology through the 60s and 70s. Now, around the world, because of the presence of the large commercial organisations like Westinghouse, like Framatome, and because of what are essentially very large internal markets, and by that I mean a single country that's prepared to build a lot of nuclear power stations. If you think back, the UK only built 14 AGRs, France built 50 or 60 PWRs, the US built nearly, well over 100 PWRs and BWRs as well. That meant that the PWR became the dominant technology around the world, and they were developed and built primarily by commercial organisations as well. So that meant that the costs were controlled, if I can use that phrase. They weren't used as a development project. The idea was that you would design and build a nuclear power station, and you will continue to build similar designs, and that way you can control costs. Take you back just to the technology there. This was based on the first ever designs of pressurized water reactors that were driven through those Generation 1 designs in Dresden and Shippingport. And it's very familiar. Dr. Zha's been through this already. You have a uranium oxide fuel rods, you have a water coolant and moderator system, and you pressurize that water so that it heats up to well over 300 degrees C, and that allows you to raise steam very efficiently. And if you look at the actual number of reactors built around the world today, there's well over 300 reactors around the world today, but about nearly 300 of those built worldwide are PWRs. So easily 90% of all the reactors that have been built and are being operated around the world is based on this technology. And it's no small fact that probably because it was developed through commercial means, that's why it's become so successful in terms of a technology for nuclear power. So here's a plot of the number of reactors that are built around the world versus the time scales. So there we've got early days as 1954, the first ever reactors that are being built, like Calder Hall and Shippingport and Dresden. And we can see as we develop the technology through the Generation 1, we get better and better at doing this, and the number of units rise, and then suddenly there's an acceleration as we get into this better technology, this Generation 2 types of designs, the PWR, the advanced gas reactor to a certain extent in the UK. And what we see there is the US and the French to a certain extent expanding their nuclear fleets very rapidly. And we peak around about 1980 in terms of the number of reactors that are being built and completed and operated, and then there's a rapid fall off. What you can't actually see because it's behind the video picture is a slight rise again that starts happening in the 2000s. We see the number of cancelled or suspended projects and power stations starting to peak around about the same time. Now those are primarily in the US. Remember what I said about President Carter introducing that legislation that sent a very negative message around about 1977. So we're starting to coincide with probably a political situation in the US is starting to turn against nuclear power. And in fact, if we think about that particular era there, when it becomes a peak, we have to think ourselves, why was there such a rapid drop-off? Well, you've had a chance to think about what might be the reason for that rapid drop-off and a peaking around about the late 1970s and early 80s, and some of it is driven by events. Events have always been something that the civil nuclear power industry is wary of. We're only one step away perhaps from closing of the nuclear fuel cycle or closing of the nuclear industry because of some major incident perhaps, and that's exactly what happened in 1979 in the US. There was a nuclear incident at the 3 Mile Island power plant, and an already negative situation in the US politically from President Carter's decision and growing opposition within the public against nuclear power meant that was not quite the death knell, but certainly a major effect on any new power plants, and there was virtually no new power plants were built after that in the US. Around the world it sent obviously ripples, because that meant that large corporations like Westinghouse and GE didn't have a home market anymore and needed to think about exporting their technologies. And we'll look a little bit more about events and how events have affected the nuclear industry in the next part of this lecture. Okay, we've come to the end of the second part of this lecture, and we've seen the birth and rise of the nuclear industry to its probable peak in terms of interest in Western Europe and the US around about the 1980s, the early 1980s. What we're going to look at in the next part is perhaps the situation that occurred for the next decade or so, where nuclear power to a certain extent faltered and needed to find its way.